April 1945, the core of the Nazi army, an empire crumbling under the weight of the Allied armies. The ultimate target, Berlin. The only question, which of the Allies will reach it first? The Soviet army grinding on from the east, the British or the Americans advancing from the west. Some Allied leaders like Churchill have doubts about leaving the prize to the Russians. But this is the era of good feeling, of Allied unity, and that spirit prevails. As a gesture to Russian pride, the American army stops in its tracks. It has other missions anyway, to split the German armies before they can regroup. Berlin will be captured by the Russians. Berlin is a burning derelict. The Red Army takes it in tow. Not until the end of July do American troops finally enter Berlin, with Stalin's grudging consent and after much stalling. 2 months after the German surrender, the joint occupation of the Nazi capital finally begins. And this is the capital they share, a corpse of a city, rotting in the uneasy quiet of the post-war days. The shares were officially divided by the 3 leaders at Potsdam on the outskirts of Berlin, where they met that summer, Churchill, Truman, and Stalin, meeting to dispose of Hitler's ruined legacy. The division of the country which these leaders agreed on is only temporary, so the Western Allies thought. The eastern half of the country, about the size of Tennessee, becomes the Soviet zone of occupation. The western half, more than twice as large, 3 times as populous, becomes the Western Allies' zone. Berlin is left an island surrounded by the Communist Sea, 110 miles from the Western occupation zone. The island itself is split up, the eastern sector to the Soviet, the western side divided among the French, the British, and the Americans. The West's position here depends on Soviet goodwill. Its only access to the city is along routes that cross the Soviet zone of Germany, access loosely guaranteed by the Potsdam Agreement. For a while, the Potsdam spirit reigns and Western traffic is waved through. But there are signs of danger ahead. On the ballots of Berlin's first election after the war, X marks a trouble spot. It is the election of October 1946, a vote for a city-wide government. Contrary to Russian hopes, in spite of Russian pressure, the Berliners reject most communist candidates. A pro-Western administration is voted in, and the Russians begin maneuvering to push the West out. Berlin is about to become an arena in the Cold War. In the spring and summer of 1948, a series of symbolic gestures. The Russians pack up their flag and walk out of the Kommandantur, the 4-power military government that runs Berlin. The Soviet representative leaves his desk in the Allied Control Council, which governs Germany as a whole. The main issue, Allied economic reforms. Allied unity on Germany is at an end, and the Russians lower the boom. They put Berlin under blockade by cutting off the supply lines from the west and stopping traffic on various technicalities. Their aim to squeeze the Allies out of Berlin. It doesn't work. Life is pumped into Berlin by air. For nearly a year, U.S. and British Air Force planes carry supplies of food, medicine, fuel, other vital needs for 2.5 million West Berliners and 10,000 Allied garrison troops. Once every 3 minutes, a plane lands at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport. In this crowded, hectic schedule, there is a crash landing, wreckage, and injury. But whatever the cost, the West will not be forced out of Berlin, and even the Russians finally have to realize it. The barrier's lifted. The blockade is ended in May 1949. The normal supply lines infuse West Berlin with new vigor. The Allies and West Germans work together to build a new life for the conquered. and it is startlingly new and healthy. The West Germans are ready to move forward. The atmosphere is charged with energy. Industry is revived, and there's full employment. The standard of living soars for the West German in the 10 years after the blockade. West Berlin becomes a model of Europe's new prosperity. It's an unprecedented boom, and it's manifested in large and little things. Literally, there is a blossoming of West Berlin where once there was rubble. There is plenty to buy and plenty of people to do the shopping. The Fifth Avenue of West Berlin is the Kurfürstendamm, and its elegant shops are bulging with goods, not just the necessities, plenty of luxuries. Once again, the streets are lively with cars and people. And friends meet over a stein of beer. On the other side of the Brandenburg Gate, light is a different story, a gray and drab one. In the communist satellite of East Berlin, the rubble from the war remains. Rebuilding is slow. There is little traffic, the stores are poorly stocked, and there's a long wait for what little there is. And in the people, a feeling of hopelessness and apathy becomes something else, a dangerous despair. And then June 1953, the East Berlin Revolt. The workers burn the headquarters of the Communist police and destroy its records. Thousands of East Berliners took part. They have nothing to fight with but rocks and their bare hands. The Russians throw tanks into the battle, but the East Germans keep fighting until they're overwhelmed by their occupiers. The end, of course, is never in doubt. The Russians have the physical strength to crush the uprising, although they're not able to stamp out the bitterness that caused it. East Berlin is quiet again. The physical damage is repaired. A visitor appears in 1958, Soviet Premier Khrushchev. His hosts, the Berlin communist leaders, see to it that he gets a big reception. This is the prelude to a new crisis, a proposal from Khrushchev that the Western allies agree to get out of Berlin within 6 months. But the West does not pull out. In Paris, in May 1960, there's a fresh attempt to reconcile the differences of East and West. A summit conference is called. Soviet Premier Khrushchev arrives with a look of beaming optimism. The talks are to center on the Berlin problem. President Eisenhower will speak for the United States. But a shadow already looms over the talks, the shadow of the U.S. intelligence plane, the U-2, which flies over the Soviet Union to gather data and is brought down. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, is held. Premier Khrushchev takes a walk out of the summit conference on the opening day. He will not talk unless the United States apologizes for the U-2 incident. The next words are all of blame exchanged by Russia and the United States for the collapse of the conference. Khrushchev is not the only one determined to walk away. In East Germany, refugees pour to the west at the rate of 3,000 a week. They go to the Marienfelder Center in West Berlin and then take up new lives. Many of them are professional people, doctors, teachers, engineers, whom East Berlin cannot afford to lose. And on August 13th, 1961, the communists stem the human tide from East Berlin by building the Berlin Wall. From the start, there was violence. A communist soldier hurls a smoke bomb at the jeering, protesting crowd on the other side. More trouble and water sprayed on the people who cannot stand to see their city grimly divided by what is first called a Chinese wall and which later comes to be known as the Wall of Shame. On both sides of the wall, there's fury and grief. Families are divided. Friends cannot meet. There had been a panicky rush to get out. In the last 24 hours, the border was open. More than 4,000 people hurried to West Berlin. But now the escape route is cut off, and so is hope. East and West Berliners look at one another across the wall and shout a few words with their tears. To strengthen the separation, the work on the wall continues. Communist soldiers and factory workers are brought to the job in full force. Where civilians once walked to freedom, only soldiers patrol. The wall keeps getting more formidable. Heavy anti-tank barriers are installed behind the wall at 7 key points. It's reported that Khrushchev himself once conceded that the wall is an ugly thing. But he added it must remain until a general understanding is reached between East and West Germany. The wall endures.